14th of June. Goodness gracious me. 2023. Hi everybody, welcome. Hope you're having a great night, except for the nuclear industry, of course. I'm Dana in Durnford. You call in at 709-589-4406. All lines are open. That's the wrong song. What the hell is that? Who the hell is that guy? It was supposed to be Overdrive. Instead it was, I don't know. So I'm going to do the time machine on Fukushima tanks. I'm going to give you about 125 reasons that the nuclear industry is hoodwinking you about the radiation. So the official story is the radiation is in the tanks, not the Pacific. And that's the end of the conversation. It's that simple. They're just not going to make it confusing. They're just going to leave it at that. It's easier to do that lie than a big lie. We've counted the tanks many times, and the most we came up with was 750. That's if you include all the small tanks. So there's not 1,000 tanks. So if the radiation is in the tanks, then how come the communities are abandoned? Is that a stupid question? If it is, subscribe anyway, give us a like, and click that bell. All that other weird stuff. And so, radioactive iodine found in Guma, which is right by Tokyo, at 3 sewage plants. And sewage is radioactive. The garbage is radioactive. The slag, radioactive. The water from the reclamation centers, filtration centers, is radioactive. The drinking water of Tokyo, 240 kilometers away, is radioactive. Danger reading in Tokyo, radiation there, levels that trigger evacuations, where there's 36 million people. More contaminated in areas in the exclusion zone. No, but it's all in the tanks. Japanese government withheld a radiation forecast to prevent panic in the whole of society. They hid the simulation of the radioactive fire because it was very, very bad. So you paid, Japanese paid for their education, paid for their equipment, paid for their children's dental care, paid for that department, all the equipment, gave them the authority, the monetary, to tell them when there's radioactive fallout. And they're like, no, it's very, very bad, so we can't tell you. But that's not why we hired you, morons. Thyroid abnormalities in 55% of the Fukushima girls tested age 11 to 15. Try wrapping your mind around that actual statement, the significance of it. Girls are 4 times more vulnerable than males. And it's not just true for humans. So how can it all be in the tanks when we're seeing absurd statistics like I've showed you? In the United States, the world food chain could be compromised because of Japan's radiation seems inescapable. Does it sound like it's in the tanks to anybody? Am I missing something here? France is making these models. I'll speed up 200%. This model is based on 16 days, the 26th, 15 days after the tsunami, 10 days after the last nuke plant detonated. 9 days, rather. And the whole planet is almost completely covered in 9 days of radioactive fallout. No, it's all in the tanks, Dana. Thank you very much. Nuclear report warns of an apocalyptic scenario at Fukushima. The ambassador said this could one day be considered the start of the ultimate catastrophe of the world and the planet. Does that sound like everything is in the tanks to anybody? Is anybody confused about this? Columnist, the truth must be told. Fukushima is a major global threat to all living flora and fauna. Does it sound like it's in the tanks? I believe the country will be evacuated. Number 4, fuel pool collapses. There should be hundreds of thousands of people working furiously.
The division I ran.
We had Arnie Gunnarsson. Because this is a time machine. After a couple of years, he stopped reporting on it. And they just fired everybody who wouldn't give it up and replaced him with the pro-nuclear community. Arnie, he was supposed to be anti-nuclear. He was put on a pedestal as an anti-nuclear magnet. And his wife, Megan Gunnarsson. And I placed him in the fuel pools of the building to the right. And he used to make the assemblies for the fuel pools. So if he didn't know they were gone, who would?
Built nuclear fuel racks for boiling water reactors exactly like Fukushima.
And yet he didn't know. So therefore that gave him credit, right? Because the industry is so secret, the majority of the population has no concept of where the fuel pool is. It's very convenient when you have an accident to have a population that is completely complacent. Former Japan officials' unstoppable contamination of the Pacific Ocean is menacing the U.S. West Coast. It's menacing. Does that sound like it's in the tanks to anybody? The wave of radiation was 10 times more than the entire world's nuclear test combined. It was actually infinitely worse than that. High concentrations of hot particles in the Pacific Northwest. Does it sound like it's in the tanks? What's so confusing about this? How is it people... Well, the world needs to understand this information desperately, and it's game over for the nuclear industry right away. We may not be able to live in Japan someday. Radiation is going to be flowing out for a long time. In other words, it's not in the tanks. Nuclear power generation, the only invention that may destroy the future of humans. You can't do that without destroying all the species. Does that sound like it's in the tanks? Do these people sound like they're worried about tanks to you? Major U.S. paper, time to quit nuclear power altogether, threatens the very existence of human civilization as we know it. Does that sound like they're worried about the tanks? Human civilization may destroy us, of Michio Kaku, a famous physicist from California. Liquefaction of 3 nuclear reactor cores. Nobel Prize winner, only the way to preserve human life is to completely turn away from nuclear power. Does it sound like it's in the tanks to you? 1,500 atoms of the sulfur peroxide hydrogen buckyballs per cubic meter of air in California. Does that sound like it's in the tanks to you? Xenon at 450,000 times detection levels after Fukushima in Washington persisted for weeks. Does that sound like it's in the tanks? Thank you very much. TEPCO gets, August 25th, 2015, TEPCO gets approval to release more Fukushima water into the Pacific. More. Well, they never stopped it, obviously. Like, if this was radioactive water, you couldn't stand there and survive it for more than a couple of seconds. And a paper suit can't protect you at a nuclear meltdown site. Utility hopes to be able to process and dump 150, 300 tons of contaminated water being produced daily. Hopes to be able to dump. Does that sound like it's in the tanks to you? They had 1,000 tanks in 2013. In 2023, they got 1,000 tanks. How many tanks have they built in the last 10 years? Japan's working to speed up decommissioning of Fukushima Daiichi reactors. Working to speed up. 2013, The workers are being paid $11 a day. Not an hour, but a day. At the worst disaster in human history. Their heralds are being paid $11 per day, but that's being stolen from them at the end of the week. Fukushima City, over 90,000 houses are eligible for decontamination. They say 4,000 houses have been cleaned, but 86,000 houses are eligible for decontamination. Like, you can't decontaminate a house. You can't live in that environment. You shouldn't be there for 1 minute. Does it sound like it's in the tanks to anybody? Is anybody that confused? United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, the absorbed doses in red bone marrow in just the first year. If you look at the second row of numbers, the first row is alphabetically of the communities that are not abandoned for some reason. The second number is the population, and the third number is the cesium-137 only, for some reason, becquerels per square meter. Not microsieverts, not millisieverts, but physical atoms, becquerels. Each becquerel is an atom pulsing energy at the speed of light in every direction. Well, just about the speed of light. At Fukushima City, at 229,000 becquerels a square meter, these numbers are just astronomical, inconceivable pre-Fukushima numbers. 90,000 houses are eligible for decontamination. In other words, all the houses. You can't decontaminate a house. If you find a little speck pre-Fukushima, you were supposed to build a fence, 900 circumference fence around it, 12 feet high, with international markers in different languages, so people from different countries could recognize it as a danger zone. Now they're like, well, we'll clean your house up, you'll be okay. We're the nuclear industry, we can do anything. But without being able to prevent the release of radioactive material from the nuclear meltdowns being dispersed across the country and reaccumulating on previously so-called decontaminated areas, even houses that have been worked on previously will require further work in the future. We're talking about stuff that when it gets in your body and sequesters in your body attacks white blood cells like it's a big gaping wound for the rest of your life with white blood cells. How can it be in the tank when it's everywhere else? How does that actually work? Plutonium-241 from Fukushima is 70,000 times more than the atomic bomb fallout in Japan. Large areas of oceans are contaminated by plutonium from events such as Fukushima. Build-up in the biosphere is expected. So, how can it be in the tanks when it's everywhere but the tanks? How can you have 30 million one-ton bags, but everything is in the tanks? By the way, before Fukushima, 100 becquerels a kilogram was nuclear waste. It was actually 0.1 becquerel a kilogram. 1,000 times less than that. After 100 becquerels is safe to eat. There's no such thing as a safe dose because your body attacks everything for the rest of your life with white blood cells. And for every white blood cell, you have to displace a red blood cell. That's undeniable, unassailable, incontestable documentation, right? That this has no redeeming qualities whatsoever. How can it be in the tanks when there's 30 million one-ton bags? There's 150,000 sites like that originally, but everything is in the tanks. If Fukushima polluting the entire Pacific Ocean, and we're talking about how people are dressed, but it's all in the tanks, Dana. You know, in the bags and everything else, and the food and the water. Fukushima disaster contaminated territory of Japan. The Sea of Japan. Korea. Up to 8 orders of magnitude above global fallout background, and I hate the word background with a passion, off the prefecture's coast. So how can it be in the tanks? I'm not trying to be smart, I'm just asking the question. Nuclear fallout will engulf Taiwan. People should stay home, take off their clothes. So how can it be in the tanks? Hotspots in South Korea, 1,000 times normal, 1,200 kilometers from Fukushima, but it's all in the tanks. And 30,000 one-ton bags. Radioactive rain caused 130 schools in Korea to close, yet the rain in California 10 times more, 10 million times more. So how can it be in the tanks and be covering Korea and California at the same time? How can it be in the tanks? Tanks were built to manipulate you. Japan professor 25 times more Fukushima fallout in Tokyo Bay mud than the maximum level nearby lakes nuclear bomb explosions, and the cesium flow in the rivers won't peak for another 1 or 2 years. But it's all in the tanks. And it's only tritium, Dana. It's the craziest thing imaginable that everybody is sleepwalking. Like, most of the planet is actually zombies. They're nice zombies, but they're zombies. You know what I mean? I'm not trying to be mean, but they've been lulled into such complacency that if you try to tell them the truth, they might attack you. Japan's burning Fukushima debris 10 miles from Daiichi nuclear disaster. Burning it. Burning nuclear waste. No, it's all the tanks, Dana. Thank you very much. Is the government trying to contaminate every region of Japan by burning radioactive debris? If everyone is contaminated in a relative sense, nobody was. Yeah, but it's all in the tanks, so don't worry about it. They're burning 100,000 becquerels a kilogram. 100 becquerels a kilogram is considered deadly over a period of time. You're going to end up with one of 1,800 diseases. You got 1 billion pounds of that they're going to burn. No, but it's all in the tanks. They spent 12 million yen to censor Twitter when they're burning it in a single city. It's like 54,000 US dollars. Twitter's like, thank you very much. Goodbye, Dana Durnford. How can it be in the tanks when you got 30 million one-ton bags at 150,000 sites? They aggregated that over a few years. Let me see if I can find it. Pretty good with this. Been at it a little while, you know. Dude, she blows. Even Al Jazeera said 30 million tons of contaminated soil. They had Fukushima contaminated soil. There are currently 105,000 on-site storage locations like this throughout the prefecture. 105,000 on-site, 105,000. 105,000. Imagine if you owned 105,000 trucks and you put all the keys in one drawer. And you picked a random truck, now you try to find a key. Right? It would be quite the chore, wouldn't it? Imagine you got 30,000 one-ton bags and you're going to go right on every one of them. Dana is wrong. It's only 30 million, rather. So go right on 130 million one-ton bags that nuclear is carbon-free and green and too cheap to meter, and Dana is wrong. And I'll respect you. You'd be the most unique idiot I ever come across. Top 20 U.S. newspaper. The world's food chain could be compromised. No, that's not true. It's all in the tank, Dana. The tank. Hundreds are ill after Fukushima nuclear plant rubble is burned in a Japanese city. Well, why didn't they put it in the tanks, Dana? I don't know. I'm just saying. Suffer nosebleeds, problems with the eyes, the throat, the skin. You wouldn't burn it if it was low-level race. And by the way, I counted these tanks, and I only came up with 750. These are the small ones. You can go look up all the pictures you want. You're not going to get any more tanks because I got an absurd amount of pictures. Press watches that the government dumped radioactive waste in Tokyo Bay. That can't be true, Dana. It's all in the tanks, man. The government wouldn't lie to you. They love you. At 150,000 sites like this, it's all in the tanks, Dana. Highly radioactive sewage 30 miles from Fukushima. Cesium, only talking about cesium, at 334,000 becquerels per kilogram. If your Geiger counter says 334,000 becquerels, it should say run for your life on it. Big flashing lights. Run! Just run. Because that's not real. The radiation is actually all in the tanks, right? Everything is in these tanks. That can't be real because we've been told by the media worldwide that everything is in those tanks. Tokyo's soil is so hot it should be sent to a nuclear waste dump. Tokyo. Nah, it's all in the tanks. And these bags, this is only Fukushima Prefecture. The food was banned in 14 prefectures because it's not in the tanks. Incinerating radioactive material can contaminate the environment. Wow, I would never dreamt that up on my own. That's amazing. That's so wonderful. But the official story today is everything is in the tanks. These stories don't exist anymore. Wall Street Journal, official sharply raised radiation levels for residents to get the iodine pills after the meltdown. 75 times higher than the lunatics had it recommended for children. No, it's all in the tanks, Dana. Sharp rise in iodine 131 at 3, not 1, not 2, but 3 Tokyo sewage plants. So how can it all be in the imaginary tanks? How does that work? 29 million becquerels a square meter in the soil after a rainfall in Tokyo. There must be a lot because we've been told constantly, all day, every day, for a very long time, it's in the tanks. By the way, the material we're talking about is 2 billion times more toxic than industrial poison. The harm caused by a nuclear disaster is greater than any work of man other than the atomic bomb. Radiation is like explosions going off in your cells every second for the rest of your life. And the more you consume, the more you're susceptible to 1,800 diseases and illnesses. 170,000 becquerels a kilogram in the sewage and excrements. That can't be true, Dan. It's all in the tanks. The tanks were built to manipulate you and deceive you. And it's very successful. I'll give them credit where credit's due. It's quite the biggest scam I've ever seen in human history. The people that are working on top of these bags are getting absurd doses. The numbers we're talking about are absurd. It's an insult to their life. Fukushima will start burning radioactive waste 100,000 becquerels a kilogram, and with 500 million kilograms to burn. But it's all in the tanks and the bags, Dana. 300 times more radiation released into the atmosphere from burning radioactive debris than claimed by the government. That can't be true, though, if it's all in the tanks. So let's hope it's all in the tanks. because we know the tanks were empty. And the problem with the tanks was, if you put the radioactive water, and I'll show you that coming up, we're talking about, in these tanks, you can't walk past the tank without getting a fatal dose. You're talking about 1.4 million sieverts of just beta. Xenon detection in South Korea. Criticality, spontaneous fission of curium to blame. It's 1,200 kilometers away, right? South Korea is currently covering up the story, by the way, because they want to promote the nuclear industry for the next decades. Every time you see these black bags, these are absurd, ridiculous. These bags are hand-filled, and the numbers we're talking about are absurd per kilogram. And they went through every homeless, the destitute, the victims of society, the immigrants who don't speak the language. They went through every one of them in the entire country. When they ran out of homeless people, they stopped picking up bags. They found plutonium, which is named after the devil, in every sample. And that the radiation-absorbing bacterium is everywhere on paved surfaces, and it aggregates hideous amounts of high-level radiation. It's like a magnet. Public concern for Japan's fish imports look to be justified. 6 million pounds shipped back from South Korea. Well, if that's true, how can it be in the tanks? And why do they always look like they're lost? Look at these people. Like those pictures you're looking at, the first two to your left, that's the same people. This is Photoshop. I don't know why they've done that, but they've done that. They're the exact same people. It's easy to do that, right? Green screen. I'll show you an example. Just for being, just badness. Just to be a naughty Dina. You naughty the boy, Dina. Hang on here now. What could I possibly have done with that? Oh, I know. Everything is... Huh. That's not even short of a miracle right there. There we go. Such a confusing story if you don't understand the nuances, right? So, you've probably seen this picture. This is the infamous picture of the Chernobyl melted reactor core, right? Well, wrong. You know, you're talking about estimates of up to 100 tons. So that look like 100 one-ton pickup trucks worth of nuclear waste right there to anybody? The person you see standing there was photoshopped in by a media, and the rest of the media just said, oh, oops, we'll use it anyway. So that's the original footage. So what they done was they darkened it. And then they put themselves in there. So I put myself in there. They put themselves in there, right? I darkened the original picture, like they done, and then put myself in there. Hey, look at me. I'm at Chernobyl. Ow, this is hot. Oh, my God. So we got two of us here at Chernobyl. He's taking pictures, and I'm lifting shit up so he can take pictures. Right, but that's a fake picture. And that, through all the medias worldwide have been using this for years, but that's the actual real picture. And if you took that picture, you would die. If you can see Medusa, you're going to die, right? Your organs will melt, and you'll die. They'll find you bent over with your pants pulled down. You'll excrete your organs because they melted. They're like they done with Hiroshima and Nagasaki victims. Almost the entire city of 300,000 people's radiation levels high enough to get decontaminated. What you're talking about Fukushima City, we covered that earlier. Fukushima City is supposed to be abandoned. You can't decontaminate a city, that's why they're abandoned, see? Fukushima disaster beyond a cover-up, which is the theme of the poll tonight. Has the nuclear industry or universities and media worldwide maliciously concealed Fukushima fallout in the last number of years? And the answer is overwhelmingly a big yes, they have. So these tanks, if those tanks were full of the radiation, you couldn't step over the hoses, let alone get that close to the tanks. Because you're talking about millions of sieverts in a tank. You couldn't build another tank there. Radioactive force of permanent risk must be cut down, and every gust of wind showers radiation over the village. So does it sound like it's in the tanks to anybody? Is there anybody out there that actually believe this is in the tanks? If there is, give me a call at 709-589-4406 for the pro-nuclear. 709-589-4406. Everybody would love to hear your version. We won't torture you, we promise. I swear. Seawater is being poisoned at a continuous rate from Fukushima. Does it sound like it's in the tanks to you? Cancer illnesses for Fukushima will be in 5 or 10 years. Oh, it'll be for 500 to 10,000 years now because of what they've done to us. Oh! Are we lucky enough to have a... Hello?
Hello, mate. Just come down to the other day. You're the other down, are you?
What? You're live on the show.
One of your shirts on.
Is that you, Nobby?
Yeah, it's Nobby, yeah. How are you doing?
Hi there. Well, you know how we're doing. You're called in. You're doing pretty good. I'm in second gear.
Yeah, I bought one of your shirts the other day. I'd like Dan to wear one to show me what it looks like.
Yeah, you can you say that again? I missed what you're trying to say. I'm sorry.
Okay. Hello, Dana. How are you doing?
I'm okay. I put up a couple of new shirts in the last couple of days.
I've got to turn phone you down neck when they follow the shop.
Yeah, I put up a couple new ones yesterday and the day before.
Yeah.
Which one did you order?
I bought
Did
one
you?
of your t-shirts the other day.
Yeah, which one did you? Which one do you get?
The purple one with orange ball in it and back or whatever on it.
E equals MC squared.
That's it. Yeah, that one. Yeah.
Yeah, I think another one you're talking about. I put up a new E equal MC squared.
To wear one so we can see what it looks like when it.
Yeah, when you wash it, turn it inside out, and it doesn't fade as quick.
Oh yeah, just for the print, yeah.
And so,
Cool.
Did you want to throw something out there before you forget?
No, I just phoned up to say hello, really, and just to say that, really.
Okay, good stuff. Thank you.
Yeah.
Saved whales, ban nuclear power. We got all kinds of shirts.
I am a constitutionalist, as you know.
Yeah, I hear that. We're in the nuclear,
Yeah.
but constitutionally, I get it. I cover nuclear because it's so important right now. The Constitution has been superseded by United Nations, right?
We're making sure that it never ever happens that way. We're taking. We've got a court case tomorrow.
Are you?
Against NATO. We've got a court case tomorrow, which is pretty similar to what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think I read about that a little while back. And what group is that?
Anyway, again, I've only got half an hour of international phone calls, so I'll cut it sharp.
I don't have
I'm
any
not too sure
international
of everything
phone. I don't have any international. It costs me each time. Okay, my friend, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks
Thank
a
you
lot,
for
bud.
getting your shirt. We appreciate it. Great way to spread the word. So that's Nabi in the United Kingdom. He's a constitutionalist. You ain't gonna have anything if you don't stop Fukushima is the problem, right? If you don't deal with Fukushima, then nothing else matters. Everything else gets obliterated into the ether, into the black hole of history. And history has been rewrote now since these headlines came out. I mean, they're growing food right alongside of 1-ton bags in a nuclear wasteland. In an actual nuclear wasteland. And James says he's wearing a nuclear scumbag show shirt. I love that shirt, by the way. It's a great shirt. Yeah, the Navi's accent, like mine's pretty bad. Navi's. In their country, that's how they talk, right? And TEPCO says, researchers says it's impossible to contain the radioactive wastewater leaking, and they use the word leaking. I despise the word leaking after all these years of seeing how it's used to wreck common sense. 50 becquerels a kilogram in humans, by the way, lead to irreversible lesions in the vital organs. That's for adults. Don't worry, though, because it's all in the tanks. Except for the 30 million 1-ton bags and everything that covered North America and the Pacific Ocean and Atlantic and Earth. The rest of it, little bits in the tank that are empty. If you fill up the tanks, the problem is, and I'll show you that coming up shortly, actually. We're still at the preamble of the show, believe it or not. Not just cancer, how low doses of radiation causes heart diseases, liver, lung, respiratory, pituitary, thyroid, adrenaline, Alzheimer's, dementia, autism, diabetes, Down syndrome, schizophrenia. There's 1,800 diseases and illnesses. Navi, I understood half of what you said, maybe. No offense, but, and I'm pretty bad myself, and I get it. I wouldn't want to try to talk to you on a VHF radio on the ocean. It'd be like, he's drowning out there somewhere, I think, by the sounds of it, but I don't know where. So send up a flare, because I'm never going to be able to figure out any other way where you to. It's not a disparaging comment. That's the truth. I understand. His accent is so strong, it caught me off guard. And because the phone calls are short. Anyway, we appreciate it. You bought a shirt. That helps. Look at these people. If you want to see zombies, look at this picture right here. Stay on the steel plate. The last guy is, the guy over here is in the air. He's not actually touching the ground. It's not a very good picture. But this guy here, his feet are not even touching the ground. They didn't. See this guy over here? Look how he's walking. He's like wobbling side to side. I don't know why they done it, but these are photoshopped. I guess they needed pictures with people in paper suits walking around looking busy, but there's nobody working, right? There's no tools, there's no equipment, there's no shovels, there's no wheelbarrows. Those steel plates, by the way, they're unique. They're all over the site. And when they have eruptions from the earth, from the China syndrome, they'll abandon it. They'll pave all of this, and then cement it, pave it again, and then they'll put these plates on top of that. They've done that 7, 8, 9 times there. Oh shit, I'm off my spot. Might never find my way back now. Let's hang on. These shows are difficult enough, eh? So it must be above that. I accidentally clicked to another. Here we go. We're good. Nuclear radiation is the most carcinogenic thing that exists, and it's not in the tanks. They're dumping huge amounts of Fukushima contamination into the Pacific. The Japan Prime Minister put to shame. It's not in the tanks were built to manipulate you. They're all built. And we'll run through that in a few minutes if I ever get to it. You got 30 million one-ton bags are not in the tanks for starters. There's nothing in the tanks. Tanks were built for show and tell. They let the radioactive substances flow out freely and said nothing while contaminating the ocean is just absurd. Now they're trying to cover the whole thing up because it's not in the tanks. Tanks were built to manipulate you and deceive you. Same as the 30 million one-ton bags they had the homeless and destitute picked up. Child's risk of cancer, which is just one of 1,800 diseases, is 100 times higher than the adult with the same dose because it's not in the tanks. 70% of Japan's territory is polluted. We know that because we picked up 30 million one-ton bags, ran away from communities, and it's not in the tanks. 70% of the children contaminated with radioactive cesium, all of them from outside of the Fukushima prefecture itself. $10 million becquerels a kilogram of cesium detected in the Minnesota soil. The snow crabs, I was going through the archives yesterday for the snow crabs. They're not coming back. We're going to cover that tomorrow night, hopefully. Such brutal shows to do, right? But I was, like, the stuff I found yesterday and the day before of die-offs was like, wow, holy shit. And, yeah, the reactors haven't stopped melting down and releasing absurd amounts. And, decades of dumping. You got 1,000 fuel pools worldwide hemorrhaging into the environment. You got 10 million becquerels a kilogram of cesium in Minnesota soil. So how can it be in the tanks, right? Well, the regulars that come here are aware of it. Very well, I might add. 6 in 10 Fukushima children tested of diabetes, so how can it be in the tanks? The head of Tokyo Medical Clinic, we're expecting diabetes in the children from Fukushima radiation because they know it's not in the tanks. Thank you very much. And how can you have 30 million one-ton bags of radiation, but everything is in the tanks? It's quite it's an amazing cover story. That's what the tanks are. They're the cover story. It's an amazing cover story. Radiation health specialists, children with over 11 becquerels a kilogram start to see heart problems. What's going in the bag is 100,000 becquerels a kilogram. They're growing food in a lot of it now in Okuma, which is an abandoned for 12 years. Previous cesium limits, we should be talking about uranium, plutonium, and curium, not cesium. And you talk about cesium after, is now 1,000 times higher. Well, the original numbers were 500 becquerels a kilogram. A year later, they dropped it to 100 becquerels a kilogram, right? Pre-nuclear meltdown, the limits was 0.1 becquerels a kilogram. Pre-Fukushima contamination pulse plume of the only planet we got. So if these tanks were actual food of stuff poured over the reactor core, you couldn't stand there and take the picture. That's a lethal dose. You couldn't connect the pipes because that would be a lethal dose. You can't walk there because that'll be a lethal dose. Well, you couldn't get close enough to walk there because that would be a lethal dose. When the Tokyo drinking water is unsafe because of radioactive fallout, it actually means it's not in the tanks and that it's in the environment. Former Fukushima Daiichi worker said, I believe the country will be evacuated if Fukushima Reactor 4 fuel pool caught fire. Well, there's 4 sides of Reactor 4. To the right, you can see the red depictions at the top are where the fuel pools would have been. And to the right, you can see what was left after they tore it down. And this weird creature known as Arnie Gunnarsson stabbing you in the back.
Now, the division I ran built nuclear fuel racks for boiling water reactors exactly like Fukushima. And
Unit 4 has always been my biggest concern. If you watched our website, on the very first week of the accident, I was saying that if Unit 4 were to catch fire, you'd have to evacuate Tokyo.
You'd have to evacuate Tokyo if that happened. But it's all in the tanks. There's no irony in this, right? It's 100% the most important subject in history. There should be thousands of people doing this, talking about this. I should be drowned out by thousands and thousands of people screaming at the nuclear industry. In fact, that would be the saving grace for the nuclear industry. If you did have thousands of people freaking out, then reality that I bring to the table would never make it out there. Eventually I'll make it out there because I'm the most prolific producer of documentation on this subject for over a decade. And that can't go unnoticed, right? So when you look at the energy of the tsunami as it ran through the site, you can see how the tank crushed under pressure from water. Homes are significantly contaminated in Tokyo and everywhere else worldwide. 29 million becquerels a square meter in Tokyo. High concentrations of hot particles. A single hot particle can take you out in increments over time from diseases it'll inflict on you. It compromises your immune system because your body is overwhelmed with white blood cells, which is the equivalent of leukemia, I'll add. 200,000 becquerels a kilogram of cesium and dust from outside the prefecture, so how can it be in the tanks? 1,500 atoms of sulfur per cubic meter detected in the California air, so how can it be in the tanks? 80% of the residents tested have radioactive iodine in the thyroid at 87,000 microsieverts. It's a stunning number, by the way. So how can it be in the tanks? And why is there 30 million one-ton bags? Radiation forecast kept secret to avoid panic because it's not in the tanks. It's everywhere but in the tanks. Fukushima release is so great, the radioactive aerosols in Washington up to 100,000 times normal because it's not in the tanks. Radioactive iodine in 50% of the children up to 35 microsieverts, 35,000 rather microsieverts, 35 millisieverts. These are absurd numbers. These are run now, full speed. Any nuclear scientist sees those numbers, they run away. There's zero possibility a nuclear scientist would even drive past that on a highway, let alone in that environment. You would never get them. They'd claw your eyes out of your head because they can't fight like a man, right? Per se. They'll fight like a cat or something. Radiation precautions for areas near Seattle, Vancouver, Portland. Perhaps you need to wash your shoes. No, if you need to wash your shoes because of radioactive fallout, you need to throw them away. Thyroid cancers, 30% of Fukushima now with tumors 2 centimeters or less. And thyroid glands are only 5 centimeters by 3 centimeters. So when your thyroid is 5 by 3 centimeters, the tumors are 2 centimeters. Half the size of your thyroid gland. Because 2 centimeters on its own, it don't sound so big. But if your thyroid glands are 2/3 of the width is a tumor, then all of a sudden it makes sense that, right? Because, now it also means your thyroid gland was so much radioactivity in your thyroid gland, you produced inconceivable amounts of radioactive hormones. And they would have got stored also in your pituitary gland, which is in your brain. It's extremely important. And that's the last spot you need radioactive hormones. Claims cancer increases after 10 sieverts of radiation dose. Cancer, you don't get cancer at 10 sieverts, you get melted organs. You die right away. 3 sieverts, you die within just walking past it or hanging out for a few minutes, you're going to die in a few weeks. 10 sieverts, you die in that day, period. You stay there for 50 minutes, you die 10 minutes later. Uh, 13,646 out of 38,000 children had thyroid tumors. That's pre-Fukushima. I'll find a clip for you to help you. Pre-Fukushima was 1 in a million. Oh, 1 or 2 per million, I can't remember. That's only because you had a few nuclear reactions and lots of releases.
まさに今そこに元気な人が死んでくんだよね。
But there's clear evidence rates have risen. Before the disaster in 2011, the rate of thyroid cancer was between 1 and 2 cases in every million children. Now, with about 200,000 children screened so far in government-ordered tests, there have been 18 confirmed cases of thyroid cancer and 25 suspected cases.
Yeah, and then there was 13,646 out of 38,000 when it used to be 1 or 2 per million. No, it can't be true, Dan. It's all in the tanks, right? Authorities hid the radioactive plume and pretended it was in the tanks. They picked up 30 million one-ton bags and said, oh, well, no, it's all in the tanks. It's not in the bags. Daughter had so many tumors the doctors couldn't count them all. Hospitals told not to test children because, everything's in the tanks. You don't want to screw up the fake story. So the nuclear industry is more important than your everybody and every species. Unstoppable contamination of the Pacific Ocean. Fukushima is now undeniably a global security issue, can't be brought under control. So it's not in the tanks. Excuse me, it's not in the tanks because it's everywhere but in the tanks. Now almost 100,000 Fukushima kids with thyroid problems. Parents are concerned. Well, they're like, the peer-reviewed studies were being done by Geraldine Thomas in the United Kingdom. Probably one of the most bizarre creatures human ever produced, besides Shinzo Abe. But we don't got to worry about him no more. He got what was coming. Thank goodness. 40 million becquerels of iodine-131, a single bed of kelp off California. So how can it be in the tanks? Up to a full sievert in Nami, which has been abandoned now for 12 years, but originally infant thyroid doses, 10 to 100 millisieverts, and up to a full sievert. And this is a socket they're talking about for 10 to 100 millisieverts, 600 kilometers away, up to a full sievert in Nami. Man. By the way, Tokyo newborn had a 1.1 sievert thyroid doses, or microsievert rather. The only count of food and water did not include inhaled radioactivity, did not include the first 10 days when iodine and other short-lived isotopes peaked. There's an absurd amount of these short-lived isotopes. They'll live for 30, 40, 50, 60, a couple of hundred days. It's an absurd amount we're talking about. See, you couldn't stand there if the tanks were full. Like if you're looking for leaky water from the tanks that was water you poured over melted reactor cores, your paper suit could barely protect you from paint. Radiation forecast withheld by the government. Releasing would cause unnecessary panic. The ministry decided such data would be unavailable due to loss of power. So they just picked up 30 million one-ton bags, and when you stopped looking, they took 14 million of them to Kuma, which is within sight of the Meltdowns, a ghost town, cut them open, and they're growing food in it. And the government we're talking about, the actual government. Possibility of radiation exceeding safe levels for the thyroid doses in Alaska, 6,000 kilometers away. Don't worry, Dana, it's all in the tanks except for everything, because nothing's in the tanks. 70% of the children tested in Kanto region includes Tokyo, radioactive cesium in their urine. No, Dan, it's all in the tanks. If it was in the tanks, you couldn't walk over those hoses. And when I counted the 750 tanks, I counted these two. You have actual China syndrome, and the steam covers the whole site. You have to evacuate the site because the cracks in the ground, the steam coming out of the ground in 10 sieverts in 6 places. The Geiger counter's maxed out at 10 sieverts. But they have to run away from the site because the whole site, that's 40 times normal speed. Well, you can't go back. Right? There's incredible doses. Everything is now bombarded with neutron, gammas, alphas, beta rays, and X-rays. And every time you see these weird pictures, these are what I call weird pictures, where everybody just stood up with paper suits on. And if these tanks were full of the numbers we're talking about, you could never, ever go there. U.S. states hit with extremely large peaks of Fukushima radioactive material. Well, if that, and significant amount of plutonium released for months, measured globally, blanketed the entire northern hemisphere. unless it's all in the tanks, but it can't be in the tanks. The proof it's not in the tanks is they built more than one tank in an area and there's people stood up there. If it's in the tanks, you can't stand up there. Press watches, the government dumps radioactive waste into Tokyo Bay. There's lots of people complacent, right? Think about how stupid he's got to be. Think about how what kind of moron is going to stand there and get their picture taken alongside of 1 ton bags of radiation. Radioactive iodine in Pennsylvania ran rainwater at 3,300% above the drinking water standards. So you should evacuate Pennsylvania permanently. Because if you find iodine, this means it's going to be saturated with curium, uranium, plutonium, and all the other isotopes. How can these bags exist, but everything is in the tanks? How can you have a forecast showing cesium iodines over the northwest of the United States, but everything is in the tanks? The tanks were built to manipulate you, and they seem to work really well for the majority of the population. New type of Fukushima forecast showed radioactive cesium over large sections of the United States and Canada. This was a NOAA model based on 40 days of radioactive fallout, and they're not claiming anything is in the tanks. So this is on day 15. And this is on the day 20th. And this model goes for 40 days, and then the model stops, but Fukushima doesn't. Fukushima never stops because... Is Fukushima fallout killing babies in Philadelphia? Deaths, infant mortalities are up 48% since Fukushima spiked in the tap water. Nowadays, everything's in the tanks. It's all good. We got your 6, no fears. Radioactive iodine levels up everywhere. Well, the iodine is the tracer. You can find it pretty easy. Which now you got to extrapolate uranium, plutonium, curium, strontium, and everything else. Tanks and bags, tanks and bags. Fukushima fallout in New Hampshire, radioactive iodine at 12,000 atoms per square meter in the sediment. So how can it be in the tanks? The official story is everything is in the tanks. None of this is true. Only what TEPCO says is true. That's the official story. And the official story says everything I'm showing you is not real. Nuclear policy, so the lies are extraordinary that they told. It's unbelievable. And they can't do it without the help from the media. Striking of radioactive iodine in California is so far above permitted radioactive levels. So the first couple of years, the news was coming out pretty good, but then it stopped. And now all the media is turned against us for the last 8 years or so. The dissent was pretty strong originally, and then they got their marching orders. So, if everything is in the tanks, why you got all these abandoned communities for a dozen years? Right? 181 times above drinking water standards in California for radioactive fallout from Japan. So how can it be in all these tanks? And forget there's 30 million 1 ton bags. And 30 million 1 ton bags, if you took 1 ton bag and put it in the back of a 1 ton pickup truck, you don't have 30 million times, bumper to bumper, 1 ton pickup trucks with a 1 ton bag. That's 5 rows of traffic around the entire planet, bumper to bumper. So how can it be in the tanks when you're talking about so much? Homeland Security funded study. 430 picocuries liters of radioactive iodine in Northern California rain, and it was 220 million atoms per. It was actually 20 million atoms per liter, and 220 million atoms of 129 iodine per liter. Medical journal article, 14,000 U.S. deaths spike after Fukushima fallout in just a couple of weeks, period. These are the strangest pictures. Right, you got everybody stood around in perfect painter, paper suits at nuclear meltdowns. They're surrounded by 150,000 sites like that. And the tanks were built to manipulate the population. There's 500 trillion becquerels a kilogram in Tokyo of what they call radioactive glass. So how can it be in the tanks? Why did they pick up all of these bags if it was in the tanks, right? Official admits deadly Fukushima meltdown cover-up. We lied about the meltdowns. It was a cover-up. It's a grave issue. It's an unprecedented nuclear disaster. About as bad as it gets. It's an unpardonable breach of trust. And it's not in the tanks. And so we're in real trouble. This got 4 more to get through. We'll get into another cycle of other stuff. 60 million Japanese irradiated by Fukushima. So it's not in the tanks. 50,000 square miles of Japan highly contaminated. Millions need to evacuate because it's not in the tanks. So there was 4 systems, or three major systems for water filtration. There was the series system, which coincidentally was right by reactor 4. TEPCO plans, so this story from 2013 talks about the series cesium filtration system. TEPCO plans to dump the water stored at Fukushima into the Pacific, 2013. The plant has already released enormous amounts of highly contaminated water directly into the ocean from a plethora of leaks from the reactor buildings. Oh, Dana, everything's in the tanks. After the water's passed through the crippled units, it's processed through the series system to remove the cesium, but other systems designed to remove other radioactive materials have been overwhelmed by the complexity and concentrations of contamination found at Fukushima Daiichi. So then the AREVA system, 2014, 3.5 years later in August. One of the problems will be dismantling, disposing of the system as it becomes contaminated itself after trying to process the radioactive material. The levels measured in the system posed a risk to workers during operation and maintenance, but ultimately this was the experimental they're talking about. Underneath the plant, an enormous amount of water is directly flowing into the ocean. The utility has a limited amount of water it can store on its site, and that for the last 3 years the system has been unused. This is the same as the Alps, but the French version, the AREVA, and kept out of operation. So the AREVA system, 3 years later, has yet to function reliably 3 years later. TEPCO, the utility which operated the plant, promised to treat all the contaminated water by 2015, a goal that's now admitting will not be realized. But as I already showed you, the whole thing is one great big mass genocidal scam. There are certain parts of the site they can't even go to, because every time a homeless person goes in there, they drops dead. As well as the extra fuel rods which sit in cooling pools at the top of the reactor buildings. So this is a November 7, 2013 picture. This is supposed to be journalists in their paper suits pretending they're on the top of the building, coming down from looking down on the fuel pools at reactor 4. So they're claiming inside of that, it looks like this. Which is absurd, right, to even suggest it. So it's totally fake. Japan Fukushima cleanup, 3 years on, little key work done. Mari Yamaguchi. Currently more than 500,000 tons in 2013, 14. 500,000 tons of radioactive water stored in nearly 1,000 large tanks, which cover most of the sprawling plant. That's quite the contradiction, isn't it? 1,000 large tanks. And every day about 6,000 workers pass through the guarded gates. 6,000 workers. And I showed you pictures of them stood around with their paper suits on doing nothing. There's not six. Now, TEPCO claimed they burnt 7,000 paper suits a day in their incinerators. Nearly all the workers at the Fukushima Daiichi plant are devoted to the enormous distracting problem, a still growing amount of contaminated water used to keep the damaged reactors from overheating. In 1,000 large tanks, the 6,000 people mostly are devoted to the tanks and the water. So it's a 100% scam to suggest that. Right? It's absurd to suggest that there's anybody working on. There's 6,000 workers at this site. I've never seen a picture with more than 20 people, for instance, and you won't either. TEPCO says the groundwater bypass operations are not having effect 2014. Where the water coming down the mountain, they were going to divert it around the site directly into the ocean instead of coming through the site. They're going to pump it. They also admit the ice wall is not working. They failed to deliver on a promise to install a fence to stop the radiation from leaking. And that word is a despicable word to me. I'm so sick of that word. It's absurd. It's such a disgusting thing they're doing. And they've been doing this long before 3 Mile Island. You'll see that exact connotation for every nuclear accident, leaking. At the time, TEPCO asked the government not to announce that they had committed to constructing the fences, because it's going to cost $1 billion. But the problem is you can't build a fence to stop radiation. Right? You can't build a fence that's going to stop radiation. TEPCO's ice wall not meeting expectations, not progressing according to plan. The ice stopper, because we can't make the temperature low enough to freeze the water. The ice wall will not stop the... Why didn't you build a real wall? And if there was tricky areas, then put a little ice wall there maybe, right? If there was something there that you couldn't get access to because there were so many pipes or whatever, you can surround it with some of this and build a little ice wall. So the ice wall is meant to keep the water, and then they're going to suck all the water up. It goes through the Alps and then into the tanks. That's the official story. But the problem is the water you're allegedly spraying over the melted reactor cores is absurd number, as well as all the extra fuel rods which are sitting in cooling pools at the top of the buildings. And those buildings, the top of those buildings don't exist anymore. So reactor 3 and 4 are easy visually to understand that. There's no reactor fuel pools at the top of this building and none at reactor 3. Those buildings don't exist anymore. They're completely gone. They flew over it at 1,000 feet above the ground, Americans did, and we're 3 million becquerels a square meter over 20 kilometers away. So how can it all be all in the tanks, or how can anything be in the tanks when you have these kind of emissions? So water at over a sievert per hour admitted that work has not been done to this day because of the difficulties. 2013, they done nothing to stop for over 2 years to stop the highly radioactive water, and they call it leaking, which is an incredible, revolting insult to the topic, right? 1,000 years from now, it'll still be hemorrhaging out of the reactors. TEPCO plans to dump the water stored at Fukushima Daiichi into the Pacific 2013. It's already released enormous amounts of highly contaminated water directly into the ocean. Uh, 2013, 1,000 tanks. 2014, 1,200 tanks. 2017, 900 tanks. Try walking with both of your heels and feet flat on the ground. See how that works out for you. So that was photoshopped. I don't know why they done it. Again, they're standing on steel sheets. Japan will have to dump the radioactive water into the Pacific 2019. And this line right here, 1,000 tanks. 2021, 1,000 tanks. 2022, 1,000 tanks. 2023, 1,000 tanks. Right there on that line here, over there, 1,000 tanks. And 1,000 tanks in 2013 and 1,000 in 2023. They're burning debris, grinding it up, radioactive debris, taking it around the country and burning it in incinerators. So how is that going to end up in the tanks, I wonder? Remember, Suga, the Japanese government criticizes TEPCO, a management of and the word leak really drives me nuts when I hear the word leak. TEPCO releases video of groundwater entering the crippled Daiichi complex at 2.2 sieverts per hour. So if you fill a tank up at 2.2 sieverts per hour, this is talking about liters, that's 1.4 million sieverts per tank. You couldn't build another tank alongside of it. TEPCO officials cannot estimate how frequent water will be discharged from Fukushima. So they claim if it's less than 1 becquerel per liter of cesium-134-37 and 5 becquerels of beta and 1,500 becquerels of tritium, then it will be released. The interesting question is, how can you measure tritium if you got the other isotopes there, because they drown out that single, right? TEPCO is still struggling to keep their head above contaminated water at Fukushima, no pun intended. So the numbers at the turbine, Unit 2 turbine buildings, is 8.7 million becquerels of tritium, 2.35 billion becquerels of cesium, 750 million becquerels of other radioactive material in each liter of the so-called contaminated water. So there's no way you can read tritium in that single. You get where I'm coming from? 5,000 tons of contaminated water are captured in and leaking out of this one cable trench into the ocean. These are extraordinary numbers we're talking about. And they're the real, it's much worse than that. In case one hasn't paid attention, the constant stream of international experts have called for TEPCO to be removed as the organization in charge of decommissioning the crippled Fukushima Daiichi reactors. And this is such a heartbreaking story, such an important story. Elementary school in Japan is using water bottles to shield the students from radiation. And this is Kuriyama City. This is a long ways away, 34 miles west of Fukushima Daiichi. They're using water bottles. They're filling the children are all bringing bottles, plastic bottles to school. They fill it up with water and put them in square boxes inside and outside the classrooms. Because it's not, all the radiation is, if any at all, are in the tanks. Very little is in the tanks. It's everywhere else. So imagine you going to school, your children's school classrooms are surrounded by bottles of water to shield the children from the radiation. Stacked around the classroom, outside the classroom. According to the school, it reduced the radiation levels by 1/3. It's an astounding story. The school is supposed to be abandoned. The community is supposed to be abandoned. You have to be pretty heartless. That's the worst case of child abuse I've ever seen, is to leave them in a nuclear wasteland of that magnitude and thinking that filling bottles up with water is just a pulsing of the fallout, right? It's pulsing through the walls, through the bottles, and only, cuts it down by 1/3, but the children are still being blasted by gamma shines, X-rays, neutrons, beta rays from the fallout. The fallout is pulsing energy every second. Koriyama is only 43 miles away, 60 kilometers away. It's a nuclear wasteland that should have been abandoned a long time, right away. It's an unbelievable story because the tanks, like if the tanks were full of the radiation I just showed you, you couldn't stand up there and survive it. And you can't build another tank. Residents Koriyama City, 60 kilometers away, concerned about the high amount of radioactive material around their town. So Koriyama City, according to the United Nations Scientific Committee on Effects of Radiation, unclear. Average disposition density, fallout density of cesium only, not including everything else, in Koriyama City is 162,000 becquerels a square meter, physical atoms pulsing energy at the speed of light every second, because it's not in the tanks, right? Tokyo Electric determined human error cause of contamination leak at Fukushima, contamination leak. You see, they got a bag tied onto a pipe. Like the doses we're talking about, you couldn't survive doing it. So according to the utility, 100 tons of water at 240 million becquerels per liter of beta ray. So you got to add in gammas and alphas and neutrons. And then by proxy, you got X-rays. And the X-rays are created by the pulses, the betas, the gammas, the alphas, the neutrons. They pulse energy at the speed of light every second, and they don't mingle. So when they hit each other, they change direction. That's known as a braking effect, and it's also known as an X-ray. And so fallout in your forest means all the species are getting full-body X-rays. Fallout in your community means everybody's getting full-body X-rays. Putting bottles around your school to protect the children means all this radiation braking effect is happening there. They're getting full-body X-rays. So 240 million becquerels per liter, this is physical atoms or particles per liter. Stunning numbers. You can't filter that because the filter is so radioactive. The pipes going into it are so radioactive you can never step over them, right? You can't change the filter. You can't get near it. It's lethal doses because you're gathering it up. Partially treated water at 240 million becquerels per liter, and they're calling it partially treated water. It's the kookiest story imaginable. And because I've been doing this for so long, and this is the norm. I've never seen a single time in the nuclear industry where they came across as humans, where they were like, oh shit, this is actually bad. Like, oh, it's not bad. Tell them it's like a banana. TEPCO submits criteria to nuclear regulation authorities to dump the contaminated water into the ocean 2013. TEPCO will collect the water in individual tanks once the rainwater is diluted to 10 becquerels of beta-ray. Nuclides, it'll discharge it into the ocean. But you can't discharge, you can't, all you're going to do is spread the radiation, right? You're not going to, diluting it, you can't kill it, you can't destroy it, you can't burn it and incinerate it or destroy it with acid or incinerators or something like that. You just liberate it into the environment. So they've been dumping it non-stop. They can't contain it. You can't put all this in the tanks. If you fill up a tank, you can't build any more tanks there. You can't get near the lines, the pipes. If there's a leak, you got to run away. And the leaks they're talking about is outrageous. They mention the word leaks. In any context, in any of these stories, it's an absolute outrage that somebody would use the word leak. And Reactor 3 was the mixed oxide fuel facility. Reactor 3 is completely gone. I'll show you a picture. Here's the real picture of Reactor 3. Does that look like a 19-story, 65-meter building to anybody? Is there anybody out there? And so they built this contraption off-site, brought it in, doesn't physically touch the stump of Reactor 3, built it over it and pretend that they're in a fuel pool. They've done the same thing for Reactor 4. The building doesn't even exist, but they built this contraption off-site, brought it in, told everybody to get the fuel out of Reactor 4. So 24 million becquerels per liter beta-ray, including strontium, 700,000 becquerels per liter of cesium, 1.7 million becquerels a liter of cesium-137. That's game over. You can't. All you can do is spread it out. You can't kill it. Diluting it just means is you're spreading it out everywhere. You're infesting every species in the entire ocean. Is what you're talking about. And so there's been the nuclear. Whenever the nuclear industry gets involved, like that's some creepy shit. There, International Atomic Energy Agency. Scary looking people. They're seemingly just as unable to prevent the eventual release of tritium water. Tritium water, see, like the numbers we're talking about, you're not going to see tritium in these numbers. Everything is tritiated because of 24 million becquerels of beta-rays, 700,000 becquerels of cesium-137, 1.4 million becquerels per liter of cesium. That's tritiated water. If you spread it out, you tritiate all that water, but you still have this radiation mixed in it, and it's the bioaccumulation all the way up the food chain after. So it's unbelievable dishonest to mention the word tritium. 2013, go dump it. Well, there's no tritium water in 2013 or 14. It's absurd radioactive materials. You see these big sacks? What I found interesting about them was I've seen people walking around on them, which tells me that they're not full of radioactive water that was poured over the reactor cores, because you drop dead if you try to walk around it. If you try to walk up to it, you're going to drop dead. The dumping of tritiated water likely to have a far smaller effect on the ocean. The continued outflow of contaminated water from the hemorrhaging reactor buildings. They call it leaking, and it's such a betrayal to see someone use the word leaking. And then the reality, they spoke up, said, look, if we wouldn't dump it on our own land, why should we dump it in our oceans? And if you count the small tanks like this too, there's 750 tanks. If cargo ships at sea are found to be deliberately dumping nuclear waste overboard, they're banned from doing business in many major international markets. And it seems that the continuous batch release, think about that statement, continuous batch release of radioactive water becomes standard operating procedures at the multiple nuclear meltdown where there's 8 fuel pools disappeared, as long as TEPCO, who's not a decommissioning authority, is allowed to remain in control. That's quite the statement. See, and you see him in a perfect suit. These gloves will tear apart if you touch anything, by the way. And carrying their little paper bag with their beetle boxes in it, is it? I don't even know if that's going to be a real picture because they're notorious for faking these types of pictures. I don't know why they do it, but they do it. Because these suits, the minute you touch anything, you're going to tear these suits. They're paper suits. And the gloves, again, if you touch anything, those gloves will tear apart immediately. And that mask can't filter radiation, airborne radiation, because you can put 200 million atoms on the head of a needle, but you can't see it. Those filters cannot feed it, not even a little tiny bit. TEPCO is not a decommissioning or a decontamination organization. TEPCO says radioactive substances from the radioactive fallout in Fukushima belong to the landowners, not us. Imagine saying something like that. Shinzo Abe, and they are a nuclear operator. Their approach to mitigate and deal with disaster both before and after is extremely telling, extremely criminal and monstrous, and a betrayal to humanity. Through international support, the contaminated water problems could be dealt with in a more responsible and publicly acceptable manner. The question is, how much more will be needed until the tipping point is reached and international support is not only extended but demanded? Well, it was only last month that they finally let anybody, anywhere, come in on the site. And that was nuclear scientists from South Korea who have been in the shock for the last 10 days since he came out, haven't said a word. They said they're going to give a final response at the end of the month, but why are you going to wait a month? TEPCO, now 2013, they're pretending they're at the top of this building in the fuel pool. That's what that picture is, looking at the roof of a fuel pool, a reactor 4. So originally, after it looked like that over there, they skinned it out with remote control cranes and that, and homeless that they sacrifice, and they ended up with that. And then they put a contraption over it to pretend that it looked like this. Now, this is official pictures, 100 plus feet above the stump that is over there, right? So there's all kinds of them pretending that they're at the fuel pool looking down 100 plus feet above that stump right there. And when I started zooming in on it, I was kind of confused because I was wondering why all the words on it were pixelated. America has 70 of these reactors exactly like it, by the way. TEPCO workers began removing spent fuel from this building, from the fuel pools are up at the top of the building, but the building actually doesn't exist. And we're the only people on the entire planet that is bringing you this information. There's nobody else anywhere on the entire planet, 8 billion people. There's just this one voice. This is it. And I probably shouldn't even be alive. I just had 7 stents put in after 3 heart attacks 3 months ago. As soon as I got out of the hospital, the next day I done one of these shows because we got no choice. The project has been labeled by some as one of the most, and I haven't stopped since. The project has been labeled by some as one of the most dangerous nuclear operations in human history. And look at a perfect building that doesn't exist. And why is everything pixelated? Each spent fuel assembly is made of 80 fuel rods. It's actually 100. They're 12 feet long and 18 pounds each, which by assembly can contain 7,500 500 trillion becquerels of radioactivity. No, the pellets are pure uranium and plutonium. And there's around 1% of plutonium by weight, which is like 18,000 pounds. I'll show you in a second. And so claiming there's 7,500 trillion becquerels, a gram, let me explain that to you because that's probably important. I'll show you what cesium has per gram. La la, it takes me a second. Maybe. Get you some of that. 137. Here we go. How many bananas does it take? Everybody tells you like a banana, then run. So a becquerel is an atomic disintegration per second. So but an atom will produce a disintegration per second every second, a lot of it for millions of years. A Curie is 37 billion becquerels. 37 billion. And in cesium-137, there's 88 Curies per gram, so 88 times 37 billion. And in strontium-90, there's 140 Curies per gram. So it's 140 times 37 billion. So let's bring up the calculator on screen. On screen. At some point. Where you to? There we go. So it's 37 billion. Yummy. So 37 billion. We got million. I made too many. Yeah, it should be right there, Dana. Why are you so trigger happy, Dana? 37 billion times 144 equal 5.3 trillion. So 5.3 trillion, and they're saying there's 7.5 trillion becquerels per assembly. Assemblies actually weigh 1,800 pounds. A gram has half of that. So they're saying there's only a gram in each assembly. You should feel incredibly insulted that they would say something like that. Where are we to here? So 1% plutonium is 14 pounds per assembly. If we say the assembly only weighs 1,440 pounds, if we go by their numbers, right? 1,300 are spent fuel. So 14.4 pounds times 1,311 is 18,000 pounds of plutonium that was at the top of them, or in the fuel assemblies that they emit to. But we know, because we cover it for a long time, that the fuel pools were actually stuffed full of fuel rods. And the reason was because you don't have a repository to store it somewhere else, right? So everything is, they do that in America too. And so it's probably double there in each fuel pool. And you lost 8 fuel pools in 4 buildings and 4 reactor cores. The full release of the reactor 4 caused serious radiological disaster to date. Well, there it is. That's reactor 4. It's completely gone. And so that's been banished from the lexicon. The assemblies could also be moved too close together. The spent fuel rods could break or expose the air and potentially ignite. If exposed to air, they ignite. Both scenarios will potentially release a massive amount of radiation, which could necessitate the evacuation of workers from the plant. But the reactors are actually gone. They can't touch because they're already gone. So that was the cover story that they were talking about. But in reality, all the assemblies were already detonated. Officially, they got all the assemblies out. Realistically, they were all gone on the 16th of March, 2011. Give or take a couple hours. Fukushima failed to deliver the promised install a fence. We already covered it. Like, the fence is not going to help you when it's already gone. That's reactor 3. So how's the fence going to stop the radiation from getting out of that place when it's already gone? How's the fence going to stop reactor 4 emissions when it's already gone? Huh? More contaminated water leaks at Fukushima. They used the word leak. Leak. And then they talk about 290 million becquerels per cubic centimeter and 10,000 tons. So when did 10,000 tons become a leak? And 290,000 becquerels of radiation per cubic centimeter. It's extraordinary for them to use the word centimeter. It's extraordinary. Because you're starting to get into big numbers if you go by the liter. 290,000 becquerels per cubic centimeter. And I every time I see the word centimeter, cubic centimeter, it scares me because I know what they're up to. It would scare you too. 22 liters would have had 6.3 billion becquerels per liter. Some of it was even worse, they're saying. Unit 3 debris removal operation released 280 billion becquerels per hour. This was the mixed oxide fuel facility. And that sounds like a lot. It actually is, but it's not. Right? Because I showed you the numbers. 4 trillion is a gram of strontium-90. Right? It's 140 curies, and each curie is 37 billion atoms, and each atom pulses energy at the speed of light every second. And a lot of this stuff will do it for millions of years. See, man-made is different than natural. Natural stuff, the longer half-life it has, the less emissions. Man-made is the longer the half-life, the longer the emissions. It's very high power. Like plutonium, with 239 with 24,000 year half-life. In 24,000 years, it's going to be it's going to be continuous power. So despite the fact that it got a long half-life, because it's anthropogenic man-made radiation, it's going to have that energy. That's why you see, over the years all this talk about dirty bombs, and plutonium is named after the devil, because once it goes through a chain reaction, it's 2 billion times more toxic than industrial poison. Now, once you put it through a chain reaction again, it's called mixed oxide fuel. It's 2 billion times 2 billion more toxic than industrial poison, because it's already gone through a chain reaction. Cesium found in Japan steel exported to South Korea. Over the allowable levels, South Korea had to ship back 6 million pounds of fish and who knows how much steel because it was radioactive, and Japan just don't care about anybody. They don't even care about themselves, right? They kept all the children in Koriyama and Fukushima City and places, Okuma, and trying to get them out to move back into Okuma. They're growing food in Okuma, which is with an eyeball of the melting reactors that might never stop melting down for 1,000 years. TEPCO announced the estimated 1.1 trillion becquerels during cleanup debris operations at Fukushima Daiichi Unit 3. That's quite the cover story. The numbers are so shocking. It's a plume that'll cover the entire planet just from that one site. Ambassador Kennedy tours Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. Now she's pretending she's at the top of reactor 4. Spent 3 hours at the nuclear meltdown with her son at Fukushima reactor 4 spent fuel pool. That's quite the amazing trick, really. It looks just like that one Ernie Gunnison is trying to pawn off on everybody, even today. So the fuel pool is, the reactor 4 is to the right, not the left. The left is the fake one. And that's what they got done with her. And so she's probably at the Donny plant or something, or some other plant in Japan. She's not at Fukushima. We know that because Fukushima looks like the picture to the right. TEPCO says running out of room to store contaminated debris at the Fukushima Daiichi. So the idea is just burn it. 340,000 cubic meters. Now they built another incinerator there about 3 years ago. So now they have 2 incinerators. All nuclear power plants, by the way, have incinerators, because they're legally allowed to burn so much radiation every day. TEPCO to double the contaminated water storage capacity by March 2016. But remember, in 2014, they had 1,000. In 2023, they still have 1,000 tanks. They're going to double that. So you got 1,000 tanks of 480,000 tons of highly radioactive water. Not tritium, but highly radioactive water. And the tanks in 2014 were 90% full, and they had 1,000 tanks then. And I just covered that a little earlier for everybody. TEPCO committed to increasing storage capacity of the farm up to 800,000 tons by 2016. TEPCO begins work on underground ice wall. Why would you build an ice wall rather than a real wall? I'll never understand that one. Workers can't access the underground tunnels due to high radiation levels and contaminated water. And many outside experts have expressed skepticism, to say the least. Why wouldn't you build a real wall? The exhaust stacks, see those tall, skinny stacks? They exhaust the fuel pools all day long into your communities, and typically they're surrounded by farms. At 25 sieverts per hour near the surface. So just walking past that is a lethal dose. It's the same as the sniper round. The stacks. So if the stacks are that radioactive, how radioactive are the reactors? Do you get what's going on? I hope so. I know the majority of you probably do. If you've been here before, you most likely did. Jamaica reveals information about contamination on used cars from Japan. Russia rejects cars from Japan because they're all too radioactive. Japan accepts help from France, which they never did. And this was 2013. They were building this contraption on the stump. It doesn't physically touch reactor 4, and they were prepping reactor 3 for the same thing. There's reactor 3. Let me see if I can find a current picture to show you. Because this is such a crazy story, right? So let me go back to reactor 4. So reactor 4, they put that stump on it, or this cover. This is just panels with that. They built it all this off-site and laid it up there, and then pretended on the inside it looked like to the right, but it'll always look like the building to the left, right? They cleaned it up, but it's still the building to the left. See? Then they done the same thing with reactor 3, where they pretended reactor 3 they were going to get all the fuel. That was 2020. They come out and claim they got all the fuel out of reactor 3. And I'll show you what it did look like before they done that much to it. It looked like that. So then they gutted it down to this, and then they built a wall around it to take the weight of the fake reactor 3. And we just, give me a minute, see if I can find that for a bit of fun. I might have that, and I might not. Damn it. Oh well, let's keep going. So reactor 3 doesn't exist. It was a nice try though, but it actually doesn't exist. Try this again. So that was originally right after it. We're almost through. Japan's government to fund underground wall at Fukushima as more criminal charges filed against TEPCO. The project for the ice wall is $470 million. It was 260,000 people, he said, worked on the wall, which worked out roughly $1,100 per person if you don't build the ice wall. The Fukushima prefecture, the prefecture of Fukushima requested the Japanese government remove TEPCO from management of Fukushima Daiichi decommissioning. So Uchibori then got to become the governor of Fukushima, and all that went away, right? It's no secret that the Tokyo Electric is incapable and incompetent of containing the disaster at Fukushima Daiichi. And so they taped IAEA print on the back of paper suits. It's the strangest thing I've ever seen. These are most likely the homeless, because that's the only one foolish enough or complacent enough to end up in that position, right? Record radiation levels in fish off the coastline, 250,000 becquerels a cesium a kilogram. 3 days later, 277,000 becquerels a kilogram. Then a greenling fish with 510,000 becquerels a kilogram. And the only time there's cesium. Japan may have to change decontamination efforts after labor shortage. First off, you can't clean up radiation with a power washer. That's literally the worst way to try to clean up radiation. And in a paper suit, no less. So the wages are the same as regular construction jobs, except they're not $11 a day. That's what they were paying the average employee. $11 a day. And then violent releases of material 2013 at Fukushima Daiichi. So this video, very few people have seen this video. And what you're seeing, this is 40 times its regular speed or worse. And the steam that's coming up is 10 sieverts per hour. It's coming out of the ground, from cracks in the ground from the China syndrome. And what you're seeing, I'll speed it up a little bit. And watch how all of a sudden the steam takes over the site. I'll let it run again now. So the steam takes over the site. This is all night long. And so this kind of radiation we're talking about, everything that touches dies. If you're a human and you get caught in this, you're dead immediately. And that many times, they've abandoned the site many times because of stuff like that. Because it's just coming up out of the ground, right? Half of Japan's workers may be illegally contracted. TEPCO admits it'll run out of homeless in 5 years unless a way is found to reduce the radiation. And see how they got the steel plates on the grounds? That's to try to protect the homeless from radioactive pulses, gamma shines, X-rays, neutron bombardments, because you plowed a lot of radiation directly into the soil. The TEPCO threw $5 million to NOAA because pollution was going to wash up on their beaches, radioactive pollution, right? TEPCO didn't give it away because of tsunami debris, they gave it away because of radioactive pollution. But there's all kinds of different angles on the tanks, and the most I've ever come up with, if you include the small tanks, and I'll show you what I mean by that someday, any day. Bear with me. Let's get my big head in there first. So let me zoom out. I'll bring the tanks over to me here now. So you see these small tanks? If I included them and the ones behind me right here, these tanks here, and those 3 rows right there, then you get 750 tanks. But there's many different pictures. This basically tells the story right there. There's at best 750 tanks on that site. And the recent pictures we're seeing shows a lot less. So there. Alrighty. That was a tough one. That was a crazy show. China, I'm going to cover it, not tomorrow night, but Sunday night, I guess. China has a study out where they're blaming the radioactive oceans around China on the nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands. It's an interesting time to put that study out. I'll bring that up before we call it a night here. Let me grab that story. Because we didn't cover the rest of them because we might as well cover the evidence instead of the propaganda. But let's show you that study that I even said to myself, well, if I don't get to it, which is likely, then I'll try to, at the end of it, I'll just cover. Oh, it's over here. Hang on. I didn't even import it over, really? That's some dedication right there. Too busy working. Hang on. This study that came out today just cracks me up. Because China's right behind Japan. China got pounded by radioactive fallout, and still today. China's banned food from Japan, right? For over 12 years now. Okay, here we go. I'll get it this time. There we go. I needed that picture anyway, right? And so that guy in the middle shaking hands with Khrushchev, the president of Japan, allegedly went to Fukushima and he says everything's hunky-dory, have a nice day. It's outrageous. It's unbelievable evil what we're talking about. U.S. Marshall Island nuke test blamed for South China Sea radioactivity. So they're trying to blame the Americans for Fukushima fallout. 100% that have made it there, but Fukushima has been non-stop for 12 years. I'm not saying the Marshall Islands is not a concern because it's over 1 million square kilometers that are radioactive today, right? We cover that many, many times here at nuclearproctologist.org. And we're an anti-nuclear think tank. Associate professor at the University of South China. And what we do is run an educational program. Not always the best. Kind of lose it sometimes. But the radioactive fallout is real from the Marshall Islands. But what's going on right now? Like if you're not going to put Fukushima into the equation, you shouldn't be part of the conversation, right? And so the bottom depiction over there is 26 days of radioactive fallout. I can't tell, is China covered in radiation? Let's have a quicker look at this. Yeah, looking pretty bad. My first scan here. I'll bring you over. Where's China? Well, Japan is right here, and China is right behind it. What's the chance that some of this radiation that's covering the planet in 26 days made it to China? Slim to none, right? Yes, boy, I hear you. The reality of it is we covered the whole planet. All the models from all the governments worldwide and the academic studies support that assertion. So take that. I'm going to close up the poll. It was a great poll. If we got this far, don't forget to give us a thumbs up. We got more thumbs up now than we had in the last 24 hours in my last video. My last video got censored. Holy shit. My last video got censored. What do we got tonight? The truth sucks. I know, I get it. So I got 147 views on my videos since last night. 40 likes. I got 39 on this one already. Has the nuclear industry and our universities and medias worldwide maliciously concealed Fukushima radioactive fallout? That's a great big yes. That's a big yes with a W. I got 47 votes. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate that. It warms my heart when I see that kind of participation. You have a great night, everybody. Everybody have a great night. We'll see everybody tomorrow night. Tomorrow night, the plan is to do a die-off due to Fukushima video worldwide. And they go really smooth, but there's so much work right in the preambles and everything else. And so I'll have that ready. We're going to try to do that tomorrow night, hopefully. See everybody tomorrow night. And we made it through. Did we get in through on time? 12:04. We're past the 2 hour again tonight. My apologies. It's just the way it goes. There's nothing you can do about it. It's too late. It's already done. But Fukushima is a different story. At some point, we're going to have to stop Fukushima. Have a good night, everybody. We'll see everybody on the other side. We got 40 thumbs up. Woohoo! Take care, folks. I got 41 thumbs up, so we beat last night's. Hi, Colin. Good night, everybody. We'll see everybody on the next show tomorrow night at the same time, regular time. And we got horrible amount of die-offs to cover tomorrow night. We'll catch everybody there.